In the frigid darkness of the North Atlantic, in the earliest months of 1942, the survival of Great Britain hung by a thread. Few civilians understood it at the time, but the battle for control of the ocean shipping lanes had become more decisive than any fight occurring on land. Every ton of fuel, aircraft parts, ammunition, and food that crossed the Atlantic could mean the difference between endurance and collapse. And yet, beneath the waves, the Kriegsmarine's U-boat fleet was tightening a steel noose around the Allied convoys. In a desperate effort to maintain public morale and deny Germany propaganda victories, some of the most catastrophic convoy losses were buried in classified reports, sealed away for decades. Among the most tragic of them was Convoy PQ-17. Convoy PQ-17 departed Hvalfjörður, Iceland, on June 27, 1942, bound for the Soviet port of Arkhangelsk. It consisted of 35 merchant ships, escorted by 6 destroyers, 2 corvettes, 4 trawlers, and a powerful covering force commanded by Admiral John Tovey. These were no ordinary cargo ships. On board were thousands of tons of tanks, aircraft, trucks, and vital munitions desperately needed by Soviet forces fighting the German invasion on the Eastern Front. For the United States 8th Air Force and British Army Logistics Command, PQ-17 was a lifeline to a struggling ally. Yet even at departure, there was a shadow hanging over the mission. German reconnaissance aircraft had already spotted the convoy as it left Icelandic waters. Radio intercepts confirmed that Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat arm, had ordered his Wolfpacks into a tightening formation across the convoy's route. Surrounding the route as well were Luftwaffe squadrons based in Norway, including the feared KG-30, experienced in anti-shipping strikes. But it was the looming threat of the battleship Tirpitz that weighed heaviest on the minds of Allied command. The Tirpitz, sister ship to the sunken Bismarck, represented a monstrous threat. Its 15-inch guns and heavy armor could wipe out the entire convoy without firing more than a handful of shells. Radio decrypts intercepted by British naval intelligence suggested the German surface fleet was preparing to move. In London, anxiety surged through the Admiralty. First Sea Lord Dudley Pound, uncertain whether the Tirpitz was at sea or still anchored in Trondheim, made a decision that would seal the convoy's fate. On July 4 at 21:11 hours, the Admiralty ordered the covering force to withdraw westward, and, shockingly, ordered the convoy itself to scatter. The order stunned the commanders at sea. Captain Jack Broom, responsible for the close escort, later wrote in his log, "It was the most devastating signal I have ever received, sent by men without knowledge of what we faced." With formation broken, each ship was now alone in hostile waters, without radar support or coordinated air defense. The German U-boats moved in quickly, and the attacks came with relentless precision. Torpedoes struck in rapid succession, tearing apart steel hulls and igniting fuel stores that transformed the polar night into pillars of blinding flame. Survivors described the screams of men thrown into freezing water, where hypothermia claimed them within minutes. From July 5 to July 7, Luftwaffe bombers plunged from the sky in near-continuous waves. The Empire Byron, the Pancraft, and the Charles McCormick were among the first destroyed. Rescue attempts were nearly impossible, as stopping or slowing risked further attack. One American officer later recalled, "It was a graveyard stretching across the ice. We could do nothing but watch them die." By July 10, only 13 of the original 35 ships reached Soviet ports. 24 had been lost, over two-thirds of the convoy. When the survivors limped into Arkhangelsk, they found no relief. The Soviet authorities recorded losses but shared nothing about them. Telegrams sent to Britain and the United States were vague, often stating only that ships were missing. No casualty lists were published. The Admiralty classified all reports immediately, citing wartime morale. British newspapers printed no mention of the disaster, and the families of the dead were left in silence. For decades, the reasons behind the order to scatter were shrouded in mystery. Only in the 1970s, when official archives began to open, did the world learn how fear, not enemy fire, had doomed PQ-17. Historians continue to debate whether the threat of the Tirpitz was real or exaggerated, and why intelligence was interpreted with such panic. Survivors' accounts suggest that the Admiralty may have misunderstood intercepted messages or reacted to internal pressure rather than confirmed evidence. If the convoy had remained together, many experts argue, losses might have been far smaller. Instead, PQ-17 became the most catastrophic Arctic convoy disaster of the war. Even now, scattered wrecks lie resting in darkness beneath the Barents Sea, silent witnesses to decisions made far from the battlefield. And yet, PQ-17 was only the beginning. Far more secrets were still waiting in sealed wartime files, convoy tragedies hidden from public view for decades. The next would occur in the spring of 1943, when two Allied convoys sailed unknowingly into the deadliest U-boat ambush of the Atlantic. In March of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic reached its darkest and bloodiest turning point. The German Kriegsmarine, refined by years of experimentation with Wolfpack tactics, was sinking Allied ships faster than the shipyards of Britain and America could replace them. Although the public heard only fragments of the truth, High Command knew the stakes. If the convoys failed, Britain starved and the war might be lost. It was in this environment of desperation and silence that two Allied convoys, HX-229 and SC-122, sailed into what would become one of the most catastrophic ambushes of the entire war. Convoy HX-229 departed New York on March 8, 1943, escorted by a mixed group of British and Canadian warships, including the destroyers HMS Volunteer and HMS Vanessa. 5 days later, Convoy SC-122 left Halifax, carrying 60 merchant ships bound for Liverpool, guarded by a similarly modest escort force. The two convoys took slightly different routes across the Atlantic, but strong westerly storms drove them into the same shipping corridor just east of Newfoundland. Their collision into a single path was unintentional and deadly. What neither convoy knew was that German Admiral Karl Donitz had already concentrated more than 40 U-boats into multiple Wolfpacks, including the feared Robgraf, Stürmer, and Dranger groups. They lay in wait along what the Germans called the Air Gap, a vast region of the mid-Atlantic where no Allied aircraft could patrol, leaving convoys blind and alone. U-boat commander Peter Kramer of U-333 wrote in his diary, "We controlled the night. Every vessel between America and England would have to pass through our hands." Strong gales and towering waves battered the merchant ships, damage piling up long before German torpedoes arrived. Frozen spray-coated decks and gun crews, and visibility fell to nearly zero. Escort commanders struggled to maintain formation. Radio silence meant no request for reinforcements could be sent. Survivors later referred to those days as the storm that drowned the compass. By March 15, U-653 spotted the convoys and shadowed them from a distance. It broadcast contact signals to the waiting Wolfpacks, guiding them into position. U-221 struck first, firing 3 torpedoes and sending the tanker British Prudence up in a column of flame that lit the ocean like a lantern in the blackness. As escorts rushed toward the explosion, additional U-boats closed in and attacked from multiple directions. Torpedoes churned the water as silence shattered into chaos. From March 16 through March 18, the battle raged without rest. The destroyer HMS Highlander reported U-boats surfacing inside the convoy columns, spraying merchant crews with machine gun fire to prevent lifeboat launches. Eyewitnesses recalled desperate men clinging to floating debris in freezing seas, their cries drowned out by engines and explosions. One survivor wrote in a letter suppressed by wartime censorship, "There were bodies everywhere. We could rescue none. To stop was death." On land, the Admiralty listened to fragmented radio intercepts with horror. Yet no public statement was released and no mention reached newspapers. The convoy escorts fought with everything they had, but their numbers were too few, their sonar battered by storm interference. Destroyers dropped depth charges blindly into the roaring ocean. Oil slicks spread for miles, and burning fuel painted the sky in sickening orange. By dawn on March 19, 21 ships had been sunk. More than 900 sailors were dead, and thousands of tons of supplies intended for the 8th Army and RAF operations lay scattered across the seabed. The Wolfpacks withdrew only when their torpedo stores ran empty. The escorts, battered and nearly out of ammunition, continued west in silence. Their orders forbade discussing the losses even with surviving merchant captains. The official Admiralty summary was stamped classified, most secret. Families of the missing were informed only that their relatives were lost in transit, or unrecoverable due to operational security. Even Allied officers were forbidden to attend memorial services. The magnitude of the disaster did not become public knowledge until decades later, when classified naval files were partially declassified in the early 1980s. The true mystery persisted. Why were two massive convoys allowed to sail blindly into the largest concentration of U-boats ever assembled? Some historians argue that British naval intelligence underestimated German capabilities, believing the Wolfpacks were weakened after recent losses. Others point to internal disputes between British and American command over escort priorities. A few naval scholars suggest an even more troubling possibility, that leadership fought to protect the secrecy of ultra-code-breaking intelligence. allowing convoys to die rather than risk revealing that Allied cryptographers were reading German encrypted transmissions. What is certain is that HX-229 and SC-122 marked a turning point. Within weeks, long-range Liberator bombers began patrolling the air gap. Escort carriers and improved radar turned the tide later that spring. But for the men who died in the March ambush, change came too late. The sea still holds the wrecks, silent steel graves in the Black Atlantic. And the archival silence surrounding their fate raises new questions that history has yet to fully answer. Ahead lay yet another tragedy, sealed deep within wartime files. The mysterious disappearance of Convoy TM-1 in the Caribbean, a convoy that left behind almost no witnesses at all. For most of the world, the Caribbean during World War II evokes images of distant shores untouched by the brutal reality of conflict in Europe or the Pacific. But beneath its calm, blue surface, the Caribbean Sea became one of the deadliest hunting grounds for German U-boats. Few Allied convoys knew this better than Convoy TM-1, a tanker group carrying highly flammable aviation fuel destined for Allied operations in North Africa. What happened to TM-1 in January 1943 would become one of the most tightly controlled wartime secrets, buried beneath layers of naval silence for decades. Convoy TM-1 departed Port of Spain, Trinidad, on January 5, 1943. The convoy was formed of 9 tankers, including the Cleona, Brilliant, St. Margaret, and Altina II, escorted by a small British detachment consisting of the destroyer HMS Havelock and several smaller corvettes. Their mission was critical: deliver desperately needed aviation fuel to Gibraltar, where Allied forces prepared for operations across the Mediterranean following the invasion of North Africa under Operation Torch. The fuel aboard TM-1 would sustain the RAF and the U.S. Army Air Forces fighting the Luftwaffe across Tunisia. Yet the Allies underestimated the danger. In late 1942, German Admiral Karl Donitz, encouraged by Japan's advances and Italy's collapse in the Mediterranean, ordered aggressive submarine operations in the Caribbean and South Atlantic. U-boat aces, among them Captain Lieutenant Ernst Cowles of U-130, were deployed to hunt Allied shipping leaving the oil-rich coasts of Trinidad and Venezuela. Cowles and his crew had already sunk 12 ships. Their tactics were ruthlessly precise. The British command believed that TM-1's speed and remote location would protect it, but the Germans were already tracking the convoy's movements through radio intercepts and reconnaissance aircraft operating from Vichy-held territories. Unbeknownst to TM-1's escort, U-130 had positioned itself directly along the convoy's projected path. The attack came at 4:45 hours on January 9, under a moonless sky. U-130 surfaced only meters from the convoy, using the darkness and heavy cloud cover to mask its silhouette. Survivors later described the first torpedo strike hitting the tanker Mosley, which erupted into a massive fireball visible for miles. Fueled by aviation gasoline, flames raced across the surface of the water, trapping sailors in a burning sea. HMS Havelock attempted to maneuver for a counterattack, but more torpedoes came, targeting the tankers from within the convoy columns. Within minutes, 7 tankers were ablaze. The Altina II broke apart in 2, sending towering plumes of black smoke billowing upward. The St. Margaret capsized after multiple explosions rocked its fuel tanks, hurling men across the deck. Some sought refuge in the freezing ocean only to find the water itself burning. As they struggled, a second U-boat moved in to complete the destruction. Radio logs recovered decades later revealed that Havelock sent repeated distress signals requesting air support from Trinidad and Barbados airfields, but the signals went unanswered. Communication equipment aboard the escort ships malfunctioned. Whether due to enemy jamming or technical failure remains unknown. Escape attempts were hindered by orders that no escort vessel was allowed to stop for rescue during a torpedo attack, a policy meant to prevent the loss of escort ships but one that condemned hundreds to death. By dawn the attack was over. 7 of the 9 tankers in TM-1 were gone, burned to their waterlines or sunk beneath thick sheets of oil. Over 250 sailors died within hours. Only 2 ships, the Cleona and Havelock, survived, and even they barely limped to port, scorched and shattered. The sea where the convoy fell still bears an oil residue locals would later call the Black Tide. Yet what followed deepened the tragedy into a mystery. The British Admiralty classified every detail of TM-1's destruction under the Official Secrets Act, issuing only vague public statements claiming the ships were lost due to enemy action. No mention was made of the scale of the disaster, or of the convoy's strategic importance. Families were told almost nothing. Many learned of deaths months later in short telegrams that listed their loved ones as missing, not confirmed dead. Internal documents released only in the early 2000s revealed heated debates within the Admiralty. Some officials argued that the convoy should never have sailed with such inadequate escort protection. Others insisted that no disclosure was possible without risking public confidence. One memorandum from January 1943, unsigned and heavily redacted, read, "The loss of TM1 is to remain sealed indefinitely. The consequences of disclosure could irreparably harm home front stability." The official record provided no details regarding the failure of air response. To this day, historians dispute whether Allied intelligence underestimated the U-boat threat, whether critical signals were missed due to technical faults, or whether command decisions left TM1 to defend itself for reasons still not fully understood. Meanwhile, the wrecks remained scattered across the seabed, resting in silence under layers of silt and secrecy. The disappearance of TM1 was not a turning point, but rather a warning unheeded. Just months later, another convoy carrying far more men, not supplies, would meet a similarly tragic fate. Its story would remain buried under classified seals until the late 1990s, when fragments of truth began to surface about what happened to convoy KMF-26 and the troopship HMS Rana, destroyed by a secret German weapon unlike anything the Allies had ever seen. By late 1943, Allied momentum appeared to be shifting. The invasions of North Africa and Sicily had pushed Axis forces back, and preparations were underway for assaults across the Mediterranean. Yet the sea lanes remained perilous. German aircraft and U-boats still prowled every transit corridor linking the United States and Britain to the battlefront. What happened to convoy KMF-26 would expose a new and terrifying chapter in naval warfare, one so devastating that the United States government buried every trace of it behind layers of secrecy. Families would wait more than 50 years before learning the truth. Convoy KMF-26 departed the port of Oran, Algeria, on November 25, 1943, bound for Naples. Aboard the convoy's troopship HMS Rana were over 2,000 U.S. soldiers, engineers, support personnel, and newly trained replacements destined for frontline units advancing across Italy. Many were young, fresh recruits experiencing the sea for the first time. The Rana itself was an aging British passenger liner built in 1926 and converted for wartime use, equipped with outdated anti-aircraft guns and limited defensive capability. Escorting the convoy were several British and American warships, including the destroyer USS Biddle, whose crew would later fight a desperate battle to save survivors. The men aboard the Rana believed they were relatively safe. Allied air superiority in the Mediterranean was growing, and intelligence briefings suggested minimal Luftwaffe presence in the region. What they did not know was that the Germans were preparing to test a revolutionary new weapon, one that would change naval warfare forever. German reconnaissance aircraft spotted KMF-26 moving along the North African coastline in the late afternoon of November 26. Shortly after 1700 hours, nearly 30 Heinkel He-111 bombers of Kampfgeschwader 100 approached the convoy, flying low over the water in a tight attack formation. At first, the attack looked routine. Anti-aircraft guns aboard the escorts opened fire, filling the sky with tracer arcs. Several Heinkels fell burning into the sea, their crews parachuting into the waves. Then something unfamiliar appeared. Crewmen aboard the Rana reported seeing a weapon unlike any bomb used before. A radio-guided glide bomb designated the HS-293, fitted with a rocket booster and controlled remotely from the attacking aircraft using joystick commands and flares for visual tracking. Members of the convoy later described watching the weapon maneuver in midair, turning, adjusting course, and diving with precision. Many assumed it was malfunctioning or drifting, unaware they were witnessing the first successful deployment of a guided missile in combat. At 17:30, the HS-293 slammed into the starboard side of the Rana, tearing a massive hole near the engine room. The explosion ripped through multiple decks, instantly killing hundreds and knocking out all power. Darkness fell within seconds as smoke flooded the ship. Fire spread uncontrollably. The blast also destroyed many of the lifeboat davits, rendering evacuation nearly impossible. Witnesses later recalled men standing silent, stunned, staring at the flames licking across the deck. For nearly 30 minutes after the strike, the Rana remained afloat, but chaos reigned. Communication lines had been destroyed, and no central evacuation order was issued. Many soldiers had never been trained to use life vests, and dozens drowned after jumping overboard unprepared. Others were crushed beneath collapsing metal or trapped below deck as compartments flooded. As panicked men attempted to release jammed lifeboats, German aircraft circled overhead, machine gunning the water to prevent rescue. The USS Biddle and several smaller vessels fought through burning fuel slicks and debris to reach survivors. Sailors aboard the Biddle risked their lives pulling men from the water, working for hours while tracer fire cut through waves around them. One American rescue sailor later wrote in a diary entry later unclassified, "We could hear them calling to us from everywhere in the dark. We could not reach them fast enough." By 1900 hours, the Rana disappeared beneath the surface. More than 1,100 American soldiers, 134 British crewmen, and dozens of Indian sailors serving as Lascar hands were dead, making it the single deadliest loss of American troops at sea during World War II. Yet almost none of the families were told what happened. Under immediate orders from the U.S. War Department, all survivors signed non-disclosure agreements. Telegrams sent to next of kin stated only that the men were missing at sea due to enemy action. Censorship was absolute. No newspapers reported the sinking, and no public memorial services were permitted. Even the introduction of guided missile technology, arguably one of the most significant advancements in German weapon development, remained strictly classified. Historians now believe the Allied command feared that revealing the existence of precision-guided bombs would cause mass panic and undermine confidence in naval transport capabilities. For half a century, the story remained hidden. It was not until the 1990s, when surviving veterans and families petitioned for truth, that previously sealed records were released. Many families learned only then how their sons or brothers had died. Some discovered they had spent decades searching for answers that officials had known all along. Questions still linger. Why was an aging, poorly equipped troopship carrying so many soldiers placed in a position of high risk without adequate escort protection? Why was intelligence suggesting Luftwaffe testing of new weapons ignored or undisclosed? And perhaps most hauntingly, why did governments believe the public could not handle the truth? The wreck of the Rana lies somewhere off the coast of Bougie, Algeria, unmarked and largely forgotten. But its legacy foreshadowed an unsettling pattern. When losses were too great or politically sensitive, truth vanished into classified archives. And the silence did not end there. The next tragedy, concealed beneath wartime secrecy, involved not just oil or troops, but an entire strategic shift in naval warfare. It would reveal how far command was willing to go to protect public confidence, even when transparency might have saved lives. When the smoke cleared from the sinking of the HMS Rana, the world heard almost nothing. No newspaper headlines. No public statements. No official recognition of the more than 1,100 American soldiers who had vanished beneath the waves. But behind closed doors in Washington and London, the consequences of the disaster sent shockwaves through military and intelligence communities. It became the catalyst for a sweeping and unprecedented effort to control information about convoy losses, an operation that would remain hidden for over half a century. Within days of the sinking, the U.S. War Department issued an extraordinary directive. All survivors, rescue crews, and military personnel connected to Convoy KMF-26 were ordered under threat of court-martial to never speak of what they had seen. Even chaplains were instructed to avoid addressing the incident in memorial services. The official explanation, recorded in sealed communications, claimed disclosure would jeopardize operational integrity and threaten civilian morale. Yet critics would later argue that the real reason was fear. Fear that the revelation of German guided missile technology would trigger panic. Fear that families, upon learning the truth of their loved ones' deaths, would question the competence of military planning. And fear that public outrage could derail support for upcoming operations in Italy and France. The families of the dead received telegrams marked "Missing in Action," "Lost at Sea." No details. No location. No confirmed death. Some mothers and fathers waited years, believing their sons might still be alive, captured, or stranded. Tens of thousands of Americans attended support meetings, wrote letters to Congress, and searched naval registries, none knowing that the truth lay sealed in classified vaults in Washington and London. Private correspondence between Navy officials, finally released in fragments in the 1990s, reveals the cold language used to manage the tragedy. One memo stamped confidential, not for release reads, "Disclosure of sinking mechanism, casualty scale, or loss of troop strength deemed detrimental to ongoing Mediterranean objectives. The matter is to remain restricted indefinitely." Another directive advised commanders to state only that the soldiers were lost under combat conditions, instructing officers to avoid specifics during meetings with families. Survivors themselves bore their own private torment. Many lived for decades believing the disaster would never be acknowledged. Some described recurring nightmares of burning seas and drowning voices in the dark. One survivor, Staff Sergeant Raymond F. Nichols, later recalled that when he attempted to describe the sinking to his commanding officer, he was told, "Forget what you saw. It never happened." His interview, recorded in 1996, was among the first public testimonies released after the records were partially declassified. Meanwhile, historians studying the Battle of the Atlantic struggled to understand unexplained gaps in convoy loss records from late 1943. Casualty numbers and official summaries failed to match shipping registries. Dozens of troop designations vanished from deployment logs with no explanation. Some researchers suspected clerical error or incomplete archiving. Others, more suspicious, noted the consistent removal of references to guided missile technology and the Rana's convoy. In the 1960s and 1970s, as historians gained limited access to wartime archives, hints of the truth began to surface. Declassified fragments referenced a mass casualty troopship event, without naming the ship. Naval research papers showed sudden increases in budget allocations for anti-guided missile defense programs, yet no major event was cited to justify them. Something was missing and researchers knew it. The turning point came in 1993, when surviving Rana families organized a national petition demanding full disclosure. Pressure grew, and the U.S. Department of Defense finally acknowledged the sinking 50 years after it occurred. The announcement confirmed the use of a guided missile and the death toll but offered little detail on why secrecy had been imposed. For many families, the acknowledgement was too late. Mothers and fathers had died never knowing what happened. Yet the release raised deeper questions. How many other convoy tragedies had been hidden? Were there additional disasters still classified? And what patterns might be found if the sealed convoy files were examined together? Researchers in the early 2000s, reviewing more recently opened archives, uncovered evidence suggesting systemic concealment of wartime losses that could have shaken public confidence. Patterns emerged, files reclassified under temporary suppression that became permanent, Naval Board inquiries with entire pages removed, casualty lists struck from official records. One British naval historian wrote, "It is not that these tragedies were forgotten, they were erased." The more investigators uncovered, the darker the implications became. The story of the Rana, far from an isolated incident, appeared to be part of a broader strategy. Protect morale at any cost, even if it meant burying truth at sea along with the dead. But another revelation was coming, one that would challenge even the most experienced historians. In recently released documents, investigators uncovered cryptic references to a final group of sealed losses, labeled only as convoys under special restricted review. Files so heavily redacted that even dates and ship names were removed. The last part of this story would expose the scale of silence and force the question: how many tragedies still lie hidden beneath the waves, forgotten until their archives surface from the dark? For decades after the war, the public narrative of the Battle of the Atlantic emphasized triumph, how technology, strategy, and determination turned the tide against the U-boat menace. Victory stories dominated textbooks. The darker chapters were omitted or softened. The focus remained on success, not sacrifice. Yet beneath that polished surface existed a network of buried histories, convoy tragedies erased or sealed to protect wartime confidence. The release of partial archives in the early 2000s began to expose the magnitude of what had been hidden. Among the most revealing discoveries were references to 5 convoys designated for special restricted review, files so heavily redacted that even ship names were removed. For historians studying suppressed wartime losses, these documents signaled a truth more unsettling than any single disaster. The files referenced internal Admiralty and War Department correspondence dated between 1942 and 1944 relating to convoy losses classified under what was then known as Operational Morale Blackout Protocols. These directives authorized the absolute suppression of convoy casualties that risked significant public or political blowback. PQ-17, HX-229, SC-122, TEM-1, KMF-26. Each represented not just a tactical failure but a psychological liability. More troubling still, the archival trail suggested deliberate structural concealment, not temporary censorship. One British historian described the process bluntly: "These were not closed files. These were erased files." Researchers digging through the National Archives in Kew, London, and the U.S. National Archives at College Park found multiple references to destroyed documents. Board of Inquiry transcripts were missing. Convoy logs were struck from record books. Survivor rosters disappeared entirely. Pages that remained were blacked out to the point of unreadability, some containing only signatures and dates. In the margins of a 1944 Naval Intelligence report, barely legible pencil handwriting stated, "Public disclosure unacceptable. Priority asset, suppression." The note was unsigned. What was being protected? The answer, emerging slowly from scattered testimonies, internal memos, and rediscovered private letters, appeared twofold. First, to conceal tactical failures and experimental weapons the Allies were not prepared to acknowledge. Second, to maintain unwavering public support at any cost. Wartime leadership believed that the collapse of morale could weaken the home front more than the loss of ships themselves. In that calculation, truth was expendable. But human consequences lingered long after the war ended. Thousands of families lived in a limbo without closure. Some received remains decades after burial. Others learned only through rumor that their sons had drowned in waters once described as secure transit zones. Official letters shared a cold sameness, refusing specifics. Military chaplains struggled silently under the constraints placed on them. Veterans carried trauma alone, unable to share memories even with their spouses. The psychological scars inflicted by silence proved as deep as those inflicted by war. In recent years, survivors and historians have pushed to reopen what remains of the classified Convoy archives. Among them is Dr. Elaine Barrett, a naval scholar whose research into missing convoy logs uncovered the existence of the Restricted Review label. In testimony before a 2004 historical records panel, she stated, "These events were hidden not because they were unclear, but because they were too clear. Their truth was simply considered too dangerous." Barrett's work identified patterns that suggest the existence of additional convoy disasters still unacknowledged, losses potentially involving Allied ships sunk in locations inconsistent with official movement records. Some researchers speculate that poor strategic decisions, kept secret during the war, drove the suppression. Others point to internal disputes between U.S. and British commands regarding resource allocation. A growing minority suggests that protecting the secrecy of intelligence capabilities, including ultra-code breaking, played a central role. If admitting knowledge would reveal the Allies were reading German communications, then silence, even at the cost of human life, prevailed. Yet for all the theories, definitive answers remain elusive. Key documents remain sealed under extended national security exemptions. Some logs appear intentionally destroyed rather than withheld. And the wrecks themselves, resting in darkness thousands of meters beneath the sea, are silent. Sonar imagery has revealed ships that should not exist where they lie. Oil signatures and debris fields have been found without identification. Historians speak cautiously of ghost convoys, fleets that left port but never arrived and never appeared in casualty lists. What remains certain is that the sea remembers what archives do not. Steel corrodes slowly. Artifacts preserved in cold depths wait patiently. As technology advances, underwater exploration grows more precise, and pressure mounts for full transparency. Families, historians, and veterans continue to demand answers, gathering each fragment of fact to rebuild stories dismantled by classified ink and decades of silence. The tragedy of the 5 convoys is not solely their destruction, but the erasure of the men who served aboard them. Their sacrifice, once hidden, now emerges into the light. The ocean that claimed their ships has become the keeper of unfinished history, urging modern generations to confront uncomfortable truths. That victory was never clean, that leadership sometimes faltered, and that the price of silence can echo longer than any battle. In time, perhaps the last sealed files will open. Perhaps names will return to monuments. Perhaps sonar will locate wrecks that have eluded searchers for 80 years. And perhaps the unanswered questions will finally rest. Until then, the story remains incomplete, a reminder that history is not only written by those who win, but also by those willing to look into darkness and ask why so many were left unseen beneath the waves.